The most inbred dynasty in history. The sun sets on the jaw, a portrait of the Spanish Habsburgs. If you walk through the hall of the Museo del Prado in Madrid, you will find them. They stare out from their gilded frames, resplendent in black velvet and white lace, their hands resting on swords and orbs. At first glance, they are the very image of imperial power, the undisputed masters of the world upon which the sun famously never set. But then, your eye catches it. A peculiar elongation of the face. A slackness of the lower lip. A jaw that seems to jut forward with a life of its own, a lantern jaw so pronounced that the mouth cannot fully close. This is the Habsburg jaw, the mandibular prognathism, the physical signature of a family that ruled half the world and was, in the end, consumed by its own blood. This is not merely a story of political decline, but a biological tragedy written on the face of a dynasty, a slow-motion genetic collapse that stands as the ultimate cautionary tale against the aristocratic obsession with purity of lineage. The story begins not in the arid plains of Spain, but in the patchwork of duchies and counties of medieval Switzerland and Germany. The Habsburgs were patient builders. Their motto, famously attributed to Emperor Frederick III, was Austria ist imperare orbi universo, it is for Austria to rule the whole world. But the shorthand was even more revealing. Bella gerent alii, tu Felix Austria nube, let others wage war, you, happy Austria, marry. From the very beginning, the foundation of their power was not the sword, but the wedding bed. They understood, with a clarity that bordered on prophetic, that in the game of dynastic politics, a strategic marriage could secure what 1,000 lances could not: a duchy, a kingdom, an entire inheritance. The pivot from ambitious counts to global emperors was engineered by Maximilian I in the late 15th century, a master of matrimonial geopolitics whose machinations would set the genetic trap for his descendants. His own marriage to Mary of Burgundy brought the wealthy Low Countries into the Habsburg orbit. Then, with the precision of a chess grandmaster, he arranged a double union of staggering consequence: his son, Philip the Handsome, to Joanna of Castile, and his daughter, Margaret, to Joanna's brother, John, Prince of Asturias. The plan was a single, unified Habsburg Spanish inheritance. Fate, in the form of a swift series of deaths, delivered an even greater prize. John died suddenly, as did other heirs to the Spanish throne. The entire, vast inheritance of Spain, Castile, Aragon, and the burgeoning empire in the Americas, fell to Joanna and, through her, to her Habsburg husband. This was the crucial moment of transmission. Joanna, daughter of the formidable Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon, was a woman of intense piety and passion, whom history would cruelly brand as Joanna the Mad. While the exact nature of her mental instability is still debated, was it schizophrenia, severe depression, or a grief-fueled breakdown grotesquely manipulated by the men around her to usurp her power? It is a darkly ironic foreshadowing. The woman who brought the Spanish bloodstream into the Habsburg line carried within her a genetic vulnerability, a seed of mental and perhaps physical frailty that would be amplified with terrifying effect over the next 2 centuries. From Joanna and Philip the Handsome, the line continued through their son, Charles. He was the ultimate inheritor, the one for whom all the marital strategies had been played. In his person, Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, gathered an inheritance too vast for one man to govern. From his father, the Burgundian Netherlands and the Habsburg lands in Austria. From his mother, the combined crowns of Spain, the Kingdom of Naples, Sicily, Sardinia, and the boundless new territories in the Americas. He was the most powerful monarch in Europe since Charlemagne, a man of profound duty and deep melancholy, who spent his life in exhausting travel trying to hold together a sprawling, fractious empire threatened by Ottoman armies and the Protestant Reformation. He saw the problem clearly. The inheritance was a dynastic miracle but a political impossibility. A single, universal empire was too much for a single human soul. In a moment of weary wisdom, he abdicated, splitting the dynasty into two branches. To his brother Ferdinand, he bequeathed the traditional Austrian lands and the title of Holy Roman Emperor. To his son, Philip, he gave the prize: Spain, the Italian possessions, the Netherlands, and the overseas empire. This was the great fork in the Habsburg road. The Austrian branch, while not immune to consanguinity, followed a different marital trajectory. The Spanish branch, however, inherited not just the throne, but an obsession. They were now the guardians of the richest empire on earth, and to protect it, to keep the inheritance from fracturing again and to prevent the dilution of its divine royal blood, they would turn inward. The happy Austria that married out was dead. In its place arose a Spanish monarchy that would marry only itself. The reign of Philip II marked the beginning of the dynasty's most fateful and fatal strategy, the deliberate, systematic effort to breed back into the Spanish royal line. The mechanism was a bizarre marital loop of uncle-niece pairings, a pattern that would define the dynasty. The logic, cold and pragmatic, was one of consolidation. A king's daughter was a valuable diplomatic asset, but her blood was pure royalty. Marrying her to a foreign prince would export that precious royal essence and, worse, potentially introduce foreign claims to the Spanish inheritance. The solution was elegant in its madness: marry her back to the senior male line. Over successive generations, this transformed the family tree from a spreading oak into a tightly wound, vertical cypress, a genetic ladder leading inexorably to a single, tragic point. Philip II himself was a product of cousin marriage, his parents being first cousins. For his fourth and final wife, he chose Anna of Austria, his own niece. She was the daughter of his sister Maria and his cousin, Emperor Maximilian II. This was the first of the great uncle-niece unions, and it produced the heir, a son who was, in genetic terms, a concentration of the line, carrying the hope of an empire in his fragile frame. That son was Philip III, a man who could not have been less like his formidable, diligent father. He was pallid, indolent, and intellectually incurious, a king whose only true passion was religious devotion. The monumental bureaucracy his father had built was handed over to a favorite, the Duke of Lamma, whose corruption became the scaffolding of the state. The physical decline was subtle but present. The political decline was a chasm opening beneath the throne. But the dynastic imperative was a machine that could not be stopped. The pure blood had to be preserved. Philip III married Margaret of Austria, who was, predictably, a Habsburg cousin. Their son, the next link in this tightening chain, was Philip IV. When the time came to secure his line, the pattern held with a horrifying, mathematical precision. Philip IV was betrothed to Isabella of Bourbon, a match that offered a brief, fleeting outcross of fresh blood. But the heir to secure the dynasty could come only from the purest source. After Isabella's death, Philip IV turned to his own niece, Mariana of Austria. She was the daughter of his sister, Maria Anna of Spain, and the Holy Roman Emperor Ferdinand III. The genetic trap was now almost perfectly sprung. Mariana was not just Philip's niece, her mother was his sister, and her father was his cousin. The entire family tree was collapsing into a single, self-referential genetic unit. It is impossible to discuss the Spanish Habsburgs without confronting the jaw. The mandibular prognathism was not a mere cosmetic quirk. It was the physical manifestation of their biological implosion, a badge of their lineage visible in every portrait. In some, it is mild, a hint of a jutting lip. In Philip IV, it is a dominant feature of a melancholic face, captured with unflinching realism by his court painter, Diego Velázquez. But in the final male of the line, it became a monstrosity, a deformity so severe it defined his entire existence. This was Charles II, the son of Philip IV and his niece Mariana, the product of a level of inbreeding that baffles the modern mind. To quantify this, the work of geneticists like Gonzalo Alvarez has been illuminating. They have calculated the inbreeding coefficient F of the Habsburgs, a measure of the probability that an individual inherits two identical copies of a gene from a shared ancestor. A child of first cousins has an F of 0.0625. Charles II's F was an astonishing 0.254. To put it in stark, human terms, his genome was more homozygous, more genetically identical on paired chromosomes, than a person whose parents were brother and sister. He was not merely the child of an uncle and a niece, he was the logical endpoint of 2 centuries of this practice, his genome a palimpsest of repeated losses of genetic diversity. The childhood mortality rate in the Spanish Habsburg family was exceptionally high, a classic sign of inbreeding depression, where harmful recessive alleles meet and are lethally expressed. From the pregnancies of the dynasty, only half resulted in a child who lived to the age of 10. Charles II was the one who survived, a survivor in whom every negative recessive trait seemed to have found a home. From the moment of his birth on November 6, 1661, he was a spectacle of suffering. The jubilant court that had prayed for a healthy male heir was met with a pitiful sight. The French ambassador wrote that the newborn prince looked as if he was already dead, with a body so weak he could barely be held. He was not expected to live a week. His jaw was so grossly deformed that his teeth did not meet, making chewing a torturous impossibility. His tongue was so large that he could barely speak, his speech remaining infantile and slurred throughout his life, a gurgling, unformed sound that made his words a permanent mystery. He could not walk until he was nearly 8 years old, a child king tottering on legs that seemed too frail to bear the weight of his crown or his massive head. He was repeatedly treated for rickets, and his body was covered in pustules. The court physicians, in their ignorance, subjected him to a series of horrific treatments, from purges and bleedings to having him carried about in a coffin-like basket with a decomposing human body, an exorcism to banish the demons they believed were the cause of his affliction. His was a body possessed not by the devil, but by a regressive assembly of genes. He was the result of a dynasty eating itself. This biological catastrophe was matched by a political and cultural decay that deepened his tragedy. The Spanish court was a petrified forest of protocol, a place where the dead hand of tradition made every action, from the king's rising to his dying, a piece of rigid theatre. This was the world of the valido, the king's favorite, a role that had become a permanent, parasitic fixture of government because the kings themselves were no longer capable of ruling. The physical and mental enfeeblement of the monarchs created a vacuum at the summit of the world's greatest empire, a vacuum filled by ambitious men. Under Philip III, the Duke of Lummer had plundered the state. Under Philip IV, the Count Duke of Oliveris, a man of immense energy but tragic vision, attempted to halt the decline through a policy of centralization, only to trigger the catastrophic revolts of Catalonia and Portugal, the latter of which permanently broke away. By the time of Charles II, the valido was a revolving door of scheming nobles, and the real power struggle was not over how to save the empire, but who would inherit its corpse. The central question of Charles II's reign was the succession. The king was married, first to Marie-Louise d'Huns, a beautiful, vivacious niece of Louis XIV of France, who withered in the suffocating gloom of the Spanish court and died young, childless. His second wife, Maria Anna of Neuburg, was a strong-willed German princess who took control of her pathetic husband, bullying him and dominating his life, but she, too, failed to produce the miracle, an heir. The court was awash in whispered accusations of his impotence, a physical reality that was likely another function of his profound genetic damage. The world was littered with diplomatic tests, including the humiliating scrutiny of his bodily fluids. The great powers of Europe circled like vultures. Louis XIV of France and Leopold I, Holy Roman Emperor, both grandsons of Philip III, both married to sisters of Charles II, had the strongest claims. The Spanish Empire, from the Philippines to Peru, from Naples to Antwerp, was to be carved up at the death of a man who could not even feed himself. In the final years of the 17th century, Charles II was a living ghost. The portraits of Juan Carreño de Miranda and Claudio Coelho show a figure of startling desolation. He stands, a pale wraith in black, in the Hall of Mirrors of the Alcázar, his impossible jaw, his watery, pleading eyes, the whole frame one of a man who is present only as a monument to decay. He was deeply religious, convinced, like many of his subjects, that his condition was a curse, a divine punishment for the sins of his ancestors. He spent his final, tortured years in a frenzy of exorcisms, fasting, and extreme penitential acts, begging a silent God to lift a curse that was not divine, but genetic. He was known, with a tragic poetry that only Spanish Baroque could invent, as El Hechizado, the Bewitched. The entire world, including himself, believed demons were responsible. The truth was far more secular, and far more damning. He was the victim of an ideology. He died on November 1, 1700, 5 days short of his 39th birthday, a wasted, bald, epileptic, prematurely ancient man. His autopsy, a clinical catalogue of horrors, was the final report of a dynasty's biological collapse. It noted his heart was the size of a peppercorn, his lungs were corroded, his intestines were putrefied and gangrenous, and his head contained only a single small, withered testicle, black as coal. He had only 3 large stones in a kidney. The medical report read like a surrealist poem of annihilation. The man who was the sum of all Habsburg blood was, in the end, an empty vessel. His will was the last political act. Under the complex and intense pressure of his court, he had finally, after agonizing delays, declared that his successor would be Philip of Anjou, the grandson of Louis XIV of France. The news arrived at Versailles. Louis presented his grandson to the court with the words, "Gentlemen, this is the King of Spain." The Austrian Habsburgs, and their allies, could not accept this. The result was the War of the Spanish Succession, a brutal, continent-wide conflict that raged for over a decade. When the dust settled, the Bourbons were on the throne of Spain, where they remain today. The Spanish Habsburgs were gone, not with a thunderous clash, but a final, silent cardiac arrest in a body that had never truly been given the chance to live. The story of the Spanish Habsburgs is not just an arcane historical curiosity. It is a terrifying morality play about the dangers of purity. In their desperate, arrogant attempt to preserve a divine bloodline, to keep power contained within a single, sacred vessel, they achieved the absolute opposite. They produced a body that could not function, a mind that could not rule, and a political vacuum that unleashed a global war. The law of genetics is an unforgiving one. It does not respect crowns, divine right, or the carefully managed image of imperial power. It only respects the biological imperative for diversity. The portraits in the Prado are not just art, they are a medical record, a graph of a falling line. The chin that juts out, the lip that sags, the tongue that is too large for the mouth, these are the physical symptoms of an ideological disease. They traded the world for their bloodline, and in the end, their bloodline took everything from them, leaving behind only a silent, suffering man, bewitched not by demons, but by the arrogance of his own family tree. The sun finally set on a jaw that could no longer hold up an empire. Excruciating chapter of this biological tragedy, the autopsy and the will. This is the terminal point of the dynasty, where the flesh fails and the political world explodes into war. Charles II's final years were a living autopsy, a public spectacle of putrefaction in progress. The man who was the lord of the world could not stand without leaning on a wall. His seizures, likely epileptic, left him twitching and insensible on the floor of his own palace. His eyesight failed. His hearing dimmed. He was plagued by chronic diarrhea and vomiting, his body incapable of processing the food that his deformed jaw struggled to chew. The court physicians, the finest in what remained of the empire, subjected him to the full arsenal of 17th-century medicine, a grotesque catalogue of enemas, purgatives, and bloodlettings applied to a body that had no blood to spare. They painted his chest with hot, eviscerated pigeon carcasses to draw out the bad humors. They rubbed his head with warm, freshly slaughtered animal entrails. And throughout it all, the most powerful man in the world was a prisoner in a decaying nursery, bullied by his wife, manipulated by his confessor, and watched by the ambassadors of Europe as one watches a candle burn down to its final flicker in a dark room. The central obsession of his final days was the supernatural. Charles was not merely a sick man, he was, in the eyes of his court and his nation, an afflicted one. The diagnosis of the era was not genetic collapse but demonic possession. He was El Hechizado, the bewitched. The theory was that as a child, he had been enchanted by a spell, a diabolical plot involving a chocolate drink laced with the ground brains and kidney fat of a dead man, designed to make his body infertile and his mind a wasteland. The irony is brutal. A narrative of satanic intervention was invented to explain what was a perfectly earthly, biological process. The church conducted exorcisms. The court's chief exorcist, a theatrical friar named Fray Antonio Alvarez de Argels, subjected the king to interrogations of the demons that supposedly inhabited him, commanding them in the name of Christ to name themselves and depart. The demons, of course, were silent. They did not exist. The curse was made of adenine, cytosine, guanine, and thymine, a sequence of base pairs repeated in a fatal loop of identicality. On September 28, 1700, Charles made his final confession and received the last rites. His body began to swell. His feet, legs, and abdomen filled with fluid, his failing kidneys and heart no longer able to maintain the basic hydraulic equilibrium of a living organism. He could no longer swallow. For 33 days, he lay dying, a public agony that mirrored the 33 years of Christ, a parallel lost on no one in that obsessively religious court. Finally, on November 1st, the Feast of All Saints, at 2:59 in the afternoon, his heart, which had never truly been robust enough to sustain him, stopped. The corpse that remained on the bed in the Alcázar of Madrid was the final, material evidence of a 200-year experiment in dynastic incest. Then came the autopsy. In the annals of historical medicine, there is no document quite like the autopsy report of Charles II of Spain. It was performed by the royal physicians, led by Dr. Juan del Vado, and its findings were a clinical litany of annihilation. The document is horrifying not just for what it describes, but for the dispassionate, methodical tone in which it catalogues the wreckage. It states that the body did not contain a single drop of blood, a hyperbolic but telling description of his chronic anemia and dehydration. The heart was described as being the size of a peppercorn, a shriveled, useless muscle that had been incapable of pumping life through his frame. The lungs were found to be corroded, riddled with tuberculosis lesions that had slowly suffocated him. The intestines, putrefied and gangrenous, were a cesspool of infection. The report's most infamous and debated line concerns the brain and reproductive organs. The brain, it was said, was largely liquefied. And then, the final, definitive verdict on the dynasty's biological potential: his testicles were as black as coal, and only one was present, small and withered. The body that had been the vessel of all Habsburg hope was a sterile, broken shell. The only thing it could generate was a world war. Because Charles was not just a man, he was a political event. His death without a direct heir was the diplomatic problem that had consumed Europe for decades. Two rival claimants stood ready, each a prince of immense power, each with a blood connection to the Spanish Habsburgs through the female line. The first was Philip of Anjou, the 17-year-old grandson of Louis XIV of France. His claim came through his grandmother, Maria Theresa, who was the daughter of Philip IV of Spain. The second was Archduke Charles of Austria, the younger son of Holy Roman Emperor Leopold I. His claim came through his grandmother, Maria Anna of Spain, who was also a daughter of Philip III. The entire political genius of the European balance of power was now focused on a single, impossibly difficult question: how do you peacefully dispose of the global empire of a man who could not chew his own food? The major powers had spent years trying to solve this puzzle without war. They had drawn up partition treaties, secret maps carving up the Spanish inheritance like a cake. But the core problem was insoluble. Neither Louis XIV nor Leopold I would accept a solution that gave the entire, undivided Spanish Empire to the other. For Louis, the prize was too rich. For Leopold, it was a matter of dynastic right. The Spanish grandees themselves, for all their empire's decrepitude, were fiercely proud and would not tolerate the dismemberment of their patrimony by foreigners. Agonized months, Charles II was the epicenter of this storm. The pro-French faction at court, led by the influential Cardinal Portocarrera, argued that only the Sun King's immense power could keep the Spanish Empire intact. The pro-Austrian faction, led by the Queen and the German clique, argued for the ancestral Habsburg right. They besieged a dying, semi-conscious man, thrusting pens into his swollen hand, demanding signatures on documents that he could no longer read. Louis XIV deployed his diplomacy masterfully, a mixture of charm, threat, and bribery. The Pope, Innocent XII, was consulted and, under French pressure, declared that the Bourbon claim was the most just, a divine endorsement that weighed heavily on the tormented king's conscience. Charles, in a moment of lucid agony, is said to have wept, lamenting that he was the most miserable of men because his ancestors had left him an empire he could not rule and now he could not even choose who would take it. Finally, on October 2, 1700, just a month before his death, Charles signed his last will and testament. He bequeathed the entire, undivided Spanish monarchy to Philip, Duke of Anjou. The condition was absolute. The crowns of France and Spain could never be united in one person. If Philip ever became heir to the French throne, he would have to choose. The will was a legal time bomb. It presented Louis XIV with an impossible choice: accept the will, defy the partition treaties he had signed with the English and Dutch, and risk a general European war, or reject the will, honor the treaties, and accept only a portion of the inheritance. Louis barely hesitated. The Italian states were already Spanish. The Americas were unimaginably rich. The strategic temptation of placing a Bourbon king in Madrid, closing off the southern flank of France and encircling the hated Habsburgs of Austria, was too great. On November 16, 1700, in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, Louis presented the young Philip to the assembled court. "Gentlemen," he announced, his voice echoing off the glass and gold, "this is the King of Spain." The Spanish ambassador, profoundly relieved that the empire would not be carved up, fell to his knees and kissed the hand of his new monarch. He then uttered the words that would justify a decade of slaughter: "Illinois envoie plus de Pyrénées, there are no longer any Pyrenees." The mountain border between France and Spain, the great barrier of European geopolitics, had, in a legal fiction, ceased to exist. The rest of Europe could not accept this. The prospect of a Bourbon superstate, a Franco-Spanish bloc under the de facto control of the Sun King, was a nightmare that England, the Dutch Republic, and Austria would fight to prevent. The War of the Spanish Succession erupted, a truly global conflict that raged from the battlefields of Blenheim and Ramillies to the forests of colonial America, where it was known as Queen Anne's War. It was a war fought on the sea, in the colonial outposts, and across the devastated landscapes of Germany, Italy, and the Low Countries. The Duke of Marlborough and Prince Eugene of Savoy won stunning victories, but the war was a grinding, bloody stalemate that lasted over a decade. When the peace was finally signed at Utrecht in 1713, the solution was a geographic compromise. Philip V was recognized as King of Spain and the Indies, but the great European encirclement of France was broken. The Spanish Netherlands, Milan, Naples, and Sardinia were ceded to the Austrian Habsburgs. Sicily went to the Duke of Savoy. Britain took Gibraltar and Minorca, the keys to the Mediterranean, and the Asiento, the horrific monopoly on the slave trade to the Spanish Americas. The great, sprawling global empire of Charles V and Philip II was permanently fractured. It was a peace settlement that shaped the map of Europe and the colonial world for the next century. The Spanish line of the House of Habsburg was no more. In its place, a French Bourbon king sat on the throne of a reduced but still vast empire. The genetic curse that had so deformed Charles II's jaw and destroyed his body was, in the political realm, the single most important cause of the war that reshaped the balance of power in the West. The inbred dynasty had finally extinguished itself, not in a quiet corner, but in a geopolitical conflagration. The body that lay on the autopsy table with a peppercorn heart and blackened, withered organs was the same body that had held the destinies of millions in its powerless hands. He was the end, not just of a family, but of an era. The sun had set on the Habsburg jaw, and from its ashes, the modern European state system was born, a system built not on the purity of divine dynastic blood, but on the cynical, pragmatic, and ultimately more stable concept of the balance of power. The lesson, written in the twisted bones of a king and the fire of a world war, was brutally clear. Purity is a poison, and in the human story, it is the mixing, not the isolating, that ensures survival.